Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be invited to join you here at Wired Live and also to follow Hannah's brilliant talk as well, which I really enjoyed and I thought beautifully teed up what I wanted to talk about, which is that at the heart of a lot of the issues I and my committee have been looking at in Parliament is that many of the great advantages of the technological revolution in the wrong hands can also create social problems. And it's the job of Parliament in occasions like that to help identify what we think the social problems are and to investigate and explore what we think the solutions to those could be. Now, it's not often that parliamentarians have the detailed technical knowledge to know how to build those solutions. But what we can do is stipulate that we think that they're needed. There aren't many MPs that could build a car, but nevertheless we have lots of legislation governing driving and the road. And I think in the same vein, it's very easy sometimes to hear criticism of big tech companies from Parliament and see that as somehow an agenda which is anti-tech. But I think to use the analogy of the car, that's a bit like saying that Parliament is anti-car because it's legislated to have seatbelts in cars. So what we've tried to do over the last year or so with the committee inquiry on disinformation and fake news was to look at some of these challenges and issues. And I think I'll say a little bit about that investigation, but I think these challenges are even more important because as we look at the application of new technology and what we think that could mean for the distribution of news and information in society, these problems become more urgent. And if anything, in 5 years' time, we might look back at the issues we're looking at today and say, challenging as they look, they were relatively easy problems to solve compared to the problems of the future. So if you look at the applications of virtual reality and augmented reality and their ability to bring back movie stars from the dead and various other personalities from the dead to engage with new audiences in different ways, that same technology can also be used to make an inflammatory speech by a politician that they never gave in a place they never were and to release that 48 hours before a general election in the hope of swaying votes. And therefore we need to think about how we would respond to some of those challenges like that. Technology being used not for the purpose that the people that created it intended, but nevertheless in a way that could be used. Now, we started our inquiry looking at really the way in which news as a form of content spread on social media and how that was starting to change the landscape of news. I was particularly struck when we started the inquiry at the BuzzFeed report in 2016 looking at the US presidential election, which showed that the top 20 fake news stories shared on Facebook were more widely shared than the top 20 real news stories. And some of these stories weren't just gossip, tittle-tattle, things that were obviously lies and wrong. They were misleading, unpleasant. One story saying that in a southern American state, freezers had been found containing the bodies of 20 white women with Black Lives Matter carved in their skin. That was amongst the top fake news stories, as well as stories that people are more familiar with, like the Pizzagate story, which alleged that Hillary Clinton was part of a paedophile ring in Washington that was keeping children trapped in the cellar of a pizza restaurant, that led to one man turning up with a gun to try and free those children and attack the paedophiles that were keeping them there. So some people act upon these sources of disinformation and fake news and do so in surprising ways. There was also research done showing that people find it very difficult to distinguish between the fake and the real because the fake is presented in a very credible way. But I don't think it's just a question of there's bad content, there's good content, and how do we create the tools to help people sort the one from the other. Often the systems used to distribute this content don't give you those tools at all. And it becomes more important, not just because of the volume with which these stories are shared on social media channels, but also because people increasingly go to social media as a source of information. The most recent studies published by Ofcom indicate that about half of people in this country get their news from social media. That means that rather than news being edited by an expert, it's being edited by an algorithm. It is the platform selecting and deciding and ranking news content that it thinks people are most interested in for those that want to engage with it and serving them more of the same. It is content being served through data analytics and micro-targeting, firing and channeling news audiences who've been expressly designed for that news. And political advertising is being targeted in the same way. And through this, it's quite possible and quite easy, actually, for concerted people, concerted campaigns to actually shape and influence the way people see the world through their experience of accessing news and information through social media. Now, in this country, about half of people access news in that way. But you go to other countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, particularly in Latin America, and you might find that 70 to 80% of people access news and information in that way. We've seen this news revolution, this information revolution, develop very quickly. And one of the problems has been that the political world and the legislative world has failed to keep up. Many of our laws that govern the way elections are fought, the way news is shared, were designed for a world really before the internet, let alone before the revolution of social media. And therefore it's time that we update some of those rules. So I believe that if you receive a political advert online, it should have the same markers, legal print that tell you who paid for it, who it's there to promote, that you would expect if you got a leaflet through your door, and actually would be required by law if you got a leaflet through your door. So it's right that some of the media companies, particularly Facebook, are now going to change their rules and systems to make sure this is a requirement. Advertisers of political messages have to reveal their real identity. And from the 7th of November, that system will go live. And I will certainly be very interested to see how effective that is. Because it was actually relatively easy for the Russians to run political adverts in America during the presidential election, because they didn't have to say they were doing it from Russia. They didn't have to, actually the pages they ran ads from looked like they were in Texas or other American states, and the user would never know. So it's important that those markers are there. But there's something I think is more important too, and I think this gets more to the focus of our attentions, and also I think the increasing concern being raised in political circles at the moment. And that is, to what extent is there a responsibility for the major tech companies to help monitor and curate in a good way what happens on their platforms, that they are not neutral to the content that's being shared, that the fault for sharing and distributing fake or misleading or harmful content rests solely on the person that posted it and not on the platform that's used to disseminate it. Now, what I believe is that the companies should have a limited legal liability for harmful and misleading content on their sites. Now, we've seen this start in Germany, where the German government, since the beginning of this year, has required that any content that is in breach of the German hate speech laws has to be removed by the social media companies within 24 hours of it being referred to them. The consequence of that law change has been the companies have complied, and they're doing it. And there's been a huge investment to make sure that they do comply, which does actually show that even though these are international businesses, you can require national law to be complied with, and it is. So that is an important step, and I'm not saying the UK should replicate that, but I think it's an important step of saying where content is illegal or it's harmful, we think where companies should be responsible in acting against it and have a time-limited slot to do it. That's very easy when you look at issues like illegal content, harmful images of children, videos that seek to radicalize people to join terror groups. I think that's very easy to say that is content that shouldn't be there. And indeed, it's already content that the companies will act against. But I think there should be a requirement in law that they do. It becomes slightly harder when you deal with more subjective issues like news and information. I don't think it's fair to say that tech companies should be the arbiters of what's true and what's false. But where we know something is definitely true, I think we should treat that as a form of harmful content. And as I referred to earlier, when you look at what would be a very pure and clean example of that, which would be deep fake films, which in the next 2 to 3 years could be a technology which is widely available and easily used in an election campaign, we have to have the ability to intervene and respond in those cases and expect the tech companies to work with us in that regard. So for me, that probably requires a change in the law that ends the platform neutrality of the big social media platforms and creates a limited liability in law for them to act against harmful forms of content, and some oversight as to how they comply with those regulations and changes. It also requires new tools for the user as well, to make it easier for them to navigate their way through the great swathes of information that are out there. So they've got the tools to see, is this source of information, does it share the characteristics of organizations that are known to be fake, that distribute fake news? Was this information being shared, say, by a page on Facebook where that page has been set up by someone who's set up thousands of other pages? They're hiding their location and their identity. Is it a source of information you should trust? If we want people to be able to decide for themselves, we have to give them the tools they will need to make those sorts of decisions. There's another area too, I think, which is more difficult, but nevertheless, I think something going forward we have to look at. And that is, are there broader social harms that we should be concerned about, that concern the way in which particularly younger people consume technology, from the amount of time they spend on screens, but also the way in which particularly social media platforms recommend content to users. If you were someone maybe who had read a story about the unsafeness of a medical vaccine, and you went on to YouTube to look for a film that might tell you about that, and you found a film that told you about that, which could be based on a conspiracy theory. And as a consequence of that, the algorithm, through the Next Up feature, directed you to look at more and more films that explained that conspiracy theory, or maybe other conspiracy theories about medication as well. That could give the user quite a distorted opinion of about what people generally thought about that problem. But nevertheless, it could be something the system is directing you towards. I don't think it's unreasonable for us to look at something like that and say, well, is the application of that technology in this case ethical? Is it fair? Is it sensible? Is that something we should be concerned about? And who's the body that should be concerned about it? Now, I think some of these things are important in their own right. I think these are the sorts of things that parliaments should take an interest in and governments should legislate on. I think we are moving into an era now where the requirement for regulatory compliance will be greater. And I think that's why the share prices of some of the big tech companies have stumbled, because the cost of the compliance is likely to be greater in the future too. But I think also solving these problems is important to help rebuild the trust between public and the application of technology. And if that relationship is not based on trust, then the dangers are that people will not as willingly embrace some of the enormous breakthroughs in technology that could be so beneficial to society, particularly in the treatment, particularly in medical treatment, and scanning for viruses and diseases and cancer as well, where there's amazing breakthroughs that can be made, but we need the consent of the people to go on that journey as well. And I think there's also an enormous opportunity for the vibrant and emerging and important tech industry in London as well. A lot of the questions and concerns we've been talking about are largely directed to many of the bigger platforms and companies, but actually it can be hungry, energetic companies in London that are the solution to some of those problems. We saw a small example of that in the public sphere when the Home Office were taking a big interest in the spreading of content that radicalizes people through online platforms, and particularly YouTube, and said, can't more be done to solve this problem, to identify proactively those films before they're referred to the company by users? And as is often the response, they were told, well, we don't think that can be done. We don't think we've got the capability to do that. So the Home Office commissioned a British company to create a tool that could identify jihadi recruitment videos on YouTube with a 99.95% accuracy rate to demonstrate that it could be done. So I would say that there are some issues that need to be addressed in the way we govern and regulate what happens in the online space. But that is really a question of saying that we think actually some of the norms and laws and regulations that are there in the rest of society should be there online as well. I think it's important we do that to rebuild trust, to create a fair environment in which these companies work. But I think alongside that, there are tremendous opportunities for companies in London and in the UK to create the solutions to some of these problems as well, to help rebuild trust and to solve some of the problems that we believe are being caused by some of the bigger American companies, if not deliberately, but as a consequence of the technology they've created. And what we're really asking for is more responsibility in how it's used and the oversight for that. So that's really been at the heart of the inquiry my committee's been running this year, as our inquiry's been broadly based but focused on news and information. Certainly in the new year, we're much more interested in looking at some of the great breakthroughs in immersive media and technology that you've been discussing here today, looking at the positive applications they have, but also how legislation and law in Parliament needs to keep pace with the changing environment, and both for good and the disruption it causes in the rest of the economy and society too. But thank you very much for listening, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Just one quick question. Obviously, there's news today around Aaron Banks and an investigation by the NCA into alleged crimes which obviously I wouldn't expect you to comment on.
I'm happy to comment if you want.
Please do comment.
Yeah. So part of again, this goes to where I started, is that technology can be used for good and bad purposes, and what we were investigating was the way in which some people used data analytics and advertising during the referendum, and that included people like Aaron Banks and Leave.eu. But one of the things we were concerned about was where the funding for his campaigns came from. And we felt that during our investigation, it wasn't clear to us what the source of his funding was. This is someone who was the biggest donor in British political history. He'd given over £8 million to the campaigns he supported during the referendum. We said it wasn't clear to us where the money had come from. It raised other concerns because we discovered information about contacts he'd had with the Russian government that hadn't been declared and other Russian business people. There are very strict laws that say donations to political campaigns in the UK have to come from UK sources. And we said if it couldn't be determined absolutely where the money had come from, then it should be referred to the National Crime Agency. It appears this afternoon that the Electoral Commission agree with us, and they've done just that.
It's just been referred to the NCA. You published your interim report. You made 42 recommendations. Government's accepted just 3 of them. Do you think there's a degree of complacency about this issue from government, or just a misunderstanding of the issues and how high the stakes are?
I'm sort of, we've been investigating this for a year, so I'm quite impatient that we move on and make progress. If you look at the sort of detail of what the government said in its response to our report, which was our interim report as well, so the final report will come in December, is the government wants to complete some of its own work it's doing. We're expecting a government white paper in February. They said winter, so the seasonal terms are always pretty stretchy in government. But so let's say February, and I think what will come of that in the white paper on online harms is a proposal to create this sort of architecture that I touched on in my remarks, whereby we say that in law we may establish limited liability for the big tech companies to act against harmful forms of content, and starting to map out what we think that sort of content should be, what we want them to do, and who will oversee it. So I think that is the direction of travel. I think we could be making faster progress towards that destination, but I think the government is pointing in the right direction, and I hope we get there in the new year.
Great. Well, we're intrigued to see how it turns out, and thank you so much for all the work you're doing. It's very important.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.